I've driven this Model 3 rear-wheel drive, or as Tesla used to call it, the standard range Model 3, over 3,500 miles now, and I'm probably going to be pretty biased on this subject because I know a lot of people that are on the fence about this or absolutely convinced that their answer is what they need for their lifestyle, and you may very well be right. I'm just simply sharing my thoughts on the debate that a lot of people are asking themselves. Should I settle for a Model 3 rear-wheel drive, save some money, or should I spend the extra money on a long-range Model 3 for that extra peace of mind? And yes, it's a little bit weird to debate because at the time of recording this, Tesla doesn't even let you order the Model 3 long range. So I guess this could also be an argument of, should I wait until Tesla starts taking orders for that Model 3 again, or should I just bite the bullet and reserve a Model 3 rear-wheel drive today? I'm not trying to say in today's video that there's a one-size-fits-all or there's a definitive answer for you, just some points that I don't think get brought up enough that people should consider before they make a decision on such a large purchase. So one thing that Tesla does not make abundantly clear to a lot of people is that the Model 3 rear-wheel drive uses a completely different battery pack than the Model 3 long range. And not just the size of the pack, but the layout of the cells and the chemistry itself is quite a bit different. So the Model 3 I'm sitting in right now uses what's called a lithium iron phosphate battery pack, which pretty much this is the only vehicle in the United States that you can buy which is currently using this chemistry. I think it'll become a lot more common in the future, but its cathode material is primarily made of iron, whereas the Model 3 long range and the Model 3 performance and basically all other Teslas that you can order in the US are using a nickel-based cathode, which has higher energy density, which allows for that longer range, but comes with its own set of downsides. So something to keep in mind when you're comparing the ranges, which is very easy to do. Model 3 rear-wheel drive, EPA estimated range of around 270 miles. Model 3 long range has an EPA estimated range of 350 miles. Important to acknowledge that you will probably not get that range number on either of these vehicles. It depends on your driving style and the speed you're going at. At highway speeds, definitely not. Maybe at city speeds, you'll get even better than that. But basically, the big difference between these two chemistries is that the iron-based battery has a much higher cycle life, which is another way of saying that it degrades slower. All batteries age with time. That's just a fact. There's no way around that. But LFP batteries are rated to last around twice as long before needing to be serviced, which with both of these vehicles is easily going to be 10, 15, maybe 20 years, depending on your charging habits and how you treat the battery. So don't believe anyone that says you have to replace your Tesla battery every 4 or 5 years. That's not true. But because the iron phosphate in the standard range Model 3 degrades slower, it means that you're going to keep a lot of that promised range at the beginning of the vehicle's life for longer than you'd get the promised range on the Model 3 long range. And the other benefit of lithium iron phosphate being a more stable and less energy dense chemistry is that you can charge it to 100% regularly. And Tesla lets you know this once you get the car, that they recommend you charge it to 100%, in fact, regularly. Because of the way iron phosphate is built, it's genuinely harder for them to understand how much energy is in the pack because the voltage doesn't change no matter what the state of charge is. So essentially, for the range estimator to be accurate, Tesla wants you. It's really good for the battery to be charged to 100% at least once a week, and Tesla even says there'd be no problem if you wanted to start every single day at 100%. I would advise against that just because I know that storing batteries at 100%, even iron phosphate, will degrade it a little bit faster, but again, Tesla's saying the degradation will be so minimal that it doesn't really even matter, whereas very different story if you opt for the long range. So those vehicles don't need to be charged to 100% regularly. In fact, it hurts the battery every time it does get charged to full, which is why Tesla directly tells you on the charging section of the car, only go to 100% right before a road trip, right? Like, don't be charging to 100% daily for everyday driving, just to go to the grocery store, get to work and back. They recommend you charge to around 80%, maybe even a little bit less would be better, which means that for your daily charging habits, if you spend that extra money on the long range and you're only charging it to 80% regularly, you're really only talking about a range of around 280 miles per day, which is not that far off from the daily 100% charging you can get with the rear-wheel drive Model 3, hitting around 270 miles. And again, keep in mind, that longer range battery pack, while yes, you'll get the benefits of that long range and higher energy density at first, this chemistry does not have as high a cycle life, which means it will degrade faster over time. So within the first couple years of ownership, I've seen people report between 10, 20, maybe even more miles of range lost, even when you do occasionally charge it to 100%. So while it may seem like a range advantage that you're paying for an extra 70 miles, within 5 years of ownership, it might be a difference closer to 50 or 40 miles just because those nickel-based batteries batteries are known to deteriorate a bit quicker than the iron phosphate batteries. The other misconception a lot of people have with EVs, and this applies to the long range versus standard range discussion, is that similar to a gas car, you charge it up to full and then you drive it until it's low, and then when you're low, you look around, try to find a charger and plug in, and then charge the battery back up to full, and then you're back on your way again. This is how we drive our gas cars, so that's what we're used to, but the truth is, to maximize trip time, batteries do not work this way, and frankly, I don't think they ever will. I've always heard about some new battery breakthrough around the corner that's going to allow faster charging, but the truth is, electrons will always pour into a battery pack faster at lower states of charge than they will at higher states of charge, at least vehicle-grade batteries, which is another way of saying that when your battery is low, it's going to charge very fast, and then once you get up to 60%, 70%, 80%, that's when the charging tapers off quite a bit, and you're not really doing yourself any favors by going up to full again. It's not good for the battery in the first place, and also it's just not time efficient. So that's why, luckily, we're in a time where electric vehicles have GPS and computers built into them where they can optimize themselves to precondition the battery before arriving at a supercharger, which basically a lot of the time means heat the battery up. That way when you plug in, the battery will charge fairly quick. And also, you plug in the destination that you want to get to, and the car will automatically tell you, here's how long you stop at this supercharger, here's how long you stop at this supercharger. And you'll notice on those trips, they're rarely telling you to charge past 80%. Most of the time, they're telling you to charge from, 13% or 18% and charge up to 60 or 70%, and then that's enough to get you to the next charger. So why do I bring that up? It's because a lot of the time people are thinking, oh, okay, I'll get a long-range Tesla, has 350 miles of range. That means I'll drive around 320 miles, and then I'll stop, charge up again, and then drive another 320 miles. No, the truth is, because of the algorithms and how the navigation handles the charging network, it really only tells you to charge until you reach your next destination, which means that you're not going to be starting from that 350 or 320 mile range every time you top off at a charger. No, it's just making sure you can reach the next one. And because Tesla has the largest and most reliable charging network out of any EV in this country and pretty much the world, that means your long-range Tesla is really only going to be charging until it can reach the next destination, which a lot of the time isn't that far at the end of the day. So if your thought process is the long-range Tesla can road trip a lot faster, it's true, I'm not trying to deny that, but the time difference in which you will arrive at your destination is not going to be a matter of hours just because you bought a vehicle that has 70 miles more range than the other. Especially if you try apps like a Better Route Planner and you plug in the vehicle that you're planning on road tripping with and you plug in the destination, you'll notice that on a lot of long distance road trips, the rear-wheel drive will arrive like 20 minutes to 40 minutes later, which, okay, maybe you care about your time that much, you're willing to spend the extra $6,000 or $7,000 to get the long-range vehicle so that you can save 20 or 40 minutes on a road trip. But just keep in mind, it's not like you're going to be stranded or you're not going to make it to your destination if you buy the standard range. You absolutely will, you're just going to be paying for it in a little bit extra time instead of cash. Would you take a job that paid $3,000 an hour? That's kind of the debate you have to have with yourself. I'll save several $1,000s by going with a shorter range Tesla and arrive at the destination somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour later. Obviously, that data gets worse if we're talking about like California to New York City road trip time, but then I feel like the biggest deciding factor on how long the trip is going to take is not going to be your charging speed, it's going to be how long you sleep for at hotels or what the traffic is like in major cities. At least in my experience, the traffic had a much bigger impact on our trip time than the charging speed did. But it is worth mentioning, the longer range Tesla does technically accept more energy. So basically, all Teslas, except for the iron phosphate one, can charge at a peak of 250 kilowatts, which does mean getting more electrons into the car faster than the rear-wheel drive would. But also keep in mind that this vehicle is the most efficient Tesla makes. So especially if we're comparing this car to, say, a Model Y long range or a Model X long range, those use more energy per mile. So even though they charge faster, they need more energy to go the same distance. So this Model 3 that I'm in, the standard range, charges at a peak of 170 kilowatts, which is still pretty good considering how efficient it is. But yeah, compared to the Model 3 long range, that will definitely get miles added back into the battery pack much faster. And just for the overhead alone, that may be worth it to you because in the future, there may be more fast charging stations. Like in my experience, I did a road trip to San Diego and back, and like 6 out of the 8 supercharging stops we made were at V2 supercharging stations, not V3, which meant that whether you had a long range or a standard range, you were pretty much maxing out at around 150 kilowatts. So it didn't even matter that other people spent more on their car because they weren't getting that 250 kilowatts at the charge station anyway. So in the future, that might turn into more of an advantage, but at least wherever you are, if you're in an area where there's not that many V3 charging stations and pretty much everything is V2, then the charging speed difference doesn't really make a big impact. I also think there's a perception problem a lot of people had with EVs, because I'm not trying to say you're dumb or you're stupid if you want to opt for the long range, because I was very close to opting for it too. You know, back when we were making our initial order, you could get the long range and we were on the fence about it. You know, it was a difference of around $6,000 and I was like, yeah, you know, a 350 mile range sounds pretty good, but that's the weird part, right? Like, you're justifying it in your head by, it sounds pretty good. And one of the main motivations of me wanting to go for the long range wasn't necessarily that I felt like, yeah, I'm gonna save 30 minutes or 40 minutes on a cross-country road trip. It wasn't about the time argument. I didn't really care if the road trip spent like an hour longer than the standard range. I realized that I liked the way it sounded when people were gonna check out the car and people were gonna ask me questions about the car. And of course, one of the most common questions is, how far can this go on a charge? And I realized I was justifying it in my head as saying it would sound really good for me to say this can go over 350 miles on a charge, but I was really gonna spend all of that extra money just so that it sounded better in my head, like it's really not that different from a gas car, people. And I realized that was probably the wrong mentality to opt for the long range, is just the idea that, well, it sounds cool to say it goes 350 miles on a charge, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that is kind of a misleading stat. I mean, for one, you're not gonna get that range anyway, but for two, how often are you really going from 100% down to under 10%? Really just on the first leg of that road trip. When you leave home, sure, you may get a full charge out of it, but after that, you're stopping at charging stations and you're only going to 60%, 70%. Afterwards, you're not breaking the 300 mile mark anyway. So what's the point in getting so obsessed with the total, like, maximum range number if majority of the time, you know, just for daily driving, you're going to be charging to 80% or less, and on the road trip, you're only going to get to 100% once at the start of the trip, and then the rest you're just going to be, you know, ping-ponging back and forth between 10% and 70%. So I think a lot of people just click with higher numbers. Like, once you pass that 300 mile mark, people just feel more comfortable. I feel like they enjoy sharing with people. Yeah, it goes over 300 miles on a charge even after this many years of ownership, and a lot of people just have that number in their head of like, yeah, I need at least 300 miles. It's just a nice sounding round number, 300, that sticks out in your mind. And I feel like a lot of people that I've noticed in Tesla reviews feel a lot more upset when their battery has degraded and they no longer can reach that magic 300 mile mark anymore. Even at 100%, it says, oh, this car only charges to 290 miles. That means I'm in the same range bracket as the standard range because it starts with a 2. I don't like that. It's a perspective of performance, when in reality, one car is going 290 miles and another car is going 310 miles. It's a difference of 20 miles. That kind of range fluctuation would be impacted just on your driving speed. How many people are in the car, and is the HVAC working really hard or not? Those kinds of little details are not that big, but they sound like a bigger deal in our head because we think over 300, under 300. Ooh, under 300 is not very good. My old gas car could go over 400 or 500. So my advice is just don't let the perception or how people look at the car or how people judge you for your purchasing decision dictate which model you buy. And I'm not saying no one should buy the long range, especially people who live in colder climates and they know their range is going to get cut in half. Those people can absolutely justify it, or people that are definitely driving like over 100 miles a day for their job. It's not common, but it does happen. Buy the long range for the functional reason. Don't just buy it for, well, it sounds good on paper and I want to be able to tell people in my personal life that it goes over 300 miles. That's the wrong motivation. And I also think that now owning this standard range Tesla for a couple months and driving it quite a bit, to be honest, on some days that involved much more driving than I expected, there is a perspective of value difference, I believe, between people who buy the long range and standard range. And what I mean by the perspective of value is, like, some people will buy the long range and they're disappointed by how often they have to charge. They're like, really? We can't make it there? And then they justify it in their head as like, well, I mean, if this is how bad the long range is, thank God I didn't get the standard range, right? Because that would be even worse than this car's performing. So they're like, whew. Whereas I feel like people who buy the cheaper model, who get the standard range, based on a lot of the reviews I've seen, there's not that many people that are regretting buying it. And I think they feel grateful because they're like, hey, I got to keep an extra $6,000. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, the car is still going? This is the Tesla with the worst amount of range, and I only have to stop this many times, or it can go that far, and that's enough for me? Like, wow, yeah, thank God I didn't go for the long range. I would have spent all that extra money for no reason. So depending on the type of personality you are, you may perceive the standard range as better than expected, and then you may perceive the long range as not as great great as you thought, but either way, the owner can justify the purchase in their head. I'm sure there are some long-range owners out there that are thinking, yeah, no, I couldn't live with the standard range. Very grateful I got the long range, especially for just the longevity of it. You know the battery's going to degrade over time, so you feel like you bought yourself more time in the future by not having a battery that ages, and even if you hit, 80% battery health or less, you'll still be going well over 220 miles on a charge, right? Which is enough to reach the next supercharger. So that perspective of value absolutely, I think, will change depending on what you buy, and I don't think there's really a wrong answer. I think anybody would be happy with either option. But I can say from personal experience that, like, recently, there was a day where there was just a lot of driving, a lot more than I'm used to doing. We're like, okay, my father-in-law was in town, and we were meeting some friends that were north of here about 40 minutes and up quite a big steep hill, so we started the day at 100%, drove all the way up there to meet our friends for breakfast, had a good time, and they saw the Tesla for the first time, and they wanted a ride in it, so, this was not part of the scheduled trip or anything, but we drove them around their neighborhood. I didn't do a 0 to 60, but I went a little fast. I showed them autopilot. They were asking me lots of fun questions about the car. We brought them back to their house, and then it was time for my father-in-law to go to the airport. So the airport is like 2 hours south, and, our friends were even further away from it than we normally are, but I wanted to pick up my dad, who was going to join us on the trip to the airport as well, so we went back to our hometown, back to my grandparents' house, who live a good 10 miles away from us, and then picked my dad up. Then we drove to the airport together, which again is pretty far, dropped off my father-in-law, picked up my mother, who was actually arriving at the airport at the same time, and we had to bring along all my father-in-law's luggage as well. We picked them up, then drove about 40 minutes north in a different direction from our hometown to get some lunch, had lunch, and it was a good time. Then we drove all the way back to my grandparents' house, dropped my dad off there and my mom, and then drove back home. And after all of that driving, it was about 200 miles worth, and it took about 4 hours because a lot of it was not at highway speeds. We ended the day with a 13% charge. So there was a lot of unexpected driving and a lot of, I don't know, maybe we'll need to supercharge. We weren't really sure, but the efficiency was good enough even with a full load and running the HVAC, and a lot of that drive being done at over 70 miles per hour, it still was able to cover a pretty complex day of driving for us that we were not expecting, and shuttling a lot of people to the airport, visiting friends out of town, and driving to grandparents' places and back, and it still got the job done. And that's the worst range Tesla you can buy. So considering that's the most amount of unexpected driving I would ever do, I'm very happy that we got the standard range and that it can comfortably handle those kind of sporadic days where there's a lot more driving than you expect. And I feel confident that, yeah, we could have spent the extra money on the long range, but I would probably just be hauling around a bunch of extra batteries that I don't really use. And especially on the non-crazy days of driving where we're just running errands, driving into town, or visiting family, that's when, like, we won't even drop like 5% in a day. We'll go from 69% down to like 65%, and those are the days where I'm like, man, the standard range even has way more range than I can use on a daily basis. So thank God I didn't spend the extra money on the long range, right? But of course, we all have different lifestyles. We all have different driving habits. I work from home, so that absolutely plays into a big factor as to why I don't feel the need for the long range, but we were still able to make great trip time on our drive to San Diego, being able to get from the southern tip of California all the way back to NorCal in about 9.5 hours, which was better than a better route planner thought we were going to do. And of course, it was a fun drive having autopilot and not having to pay for gas. So genuinely, I don't think there's a wrong answer. And if I believe that you can be happy with either, I'm going to lean towards the cheaper one because you can save yourself some money. And also, yeah, the Model 3 long range isn't even available right now. Hopefully it'll turn on again next year for those who really, really need it. But hopefully everything I discussed in today's video can give you some food for thought, make you consider if it's really worth it. I know the long range may be worth it because you want the faster acceleration or the all-wheel drive, but if you're in a colder climate, snow tires are probably going to be better than all-wheel drive is anyway. But yeah, it's all personal preference. It all comes down to what we need. But feel free to let me know your thoughts on what makes sense for you down in the comments below. And thank you to everyone on Patreon making these videos possible and supporting us directly. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.